Welcome one and all. This is our very last session. This is the sixth session of the masterclass on governance and leadership. And today we will be talking about building an optimal enterprise risk management culture. I want to talk about aspects of risk and also culture, and then look at that in the wider context of corporate governance. And from this respect, there's a lot for us to consider. So today, I want to make it a little bit more fun and interactive. Please feel free to write any questions as you go along in the chat function. If for any reason you can't see the slides, please minimize using the two arrows to bring the section up so you can see the full slide. Some of this I've developed myself. I'm also looking at Coso and ISO 31000. So welcome one and all. Today we will be speaking about building an optimal enterprise risk management culture. And so when we think about risk, many of you will already know me. When I was at, for a time I was at boarding school, I went to a naval boarding school, and one of the things that we were asked to do was to embrace fear and to get used to doing things that we weren't used to doing. So one of the things that we did was a bit of mountaineering, a bit of rock climbing. We did some abseiling. I used to be very scared of heights. And so I had to overcome a lot of fear in order to be able to do abseiling. I was able to abseil down a cliff face, both backwards and also in the most difficult way to abseil in the forward as well. Also, one of my big fears was drowning, and I was able to conquer that fear by doing scuba diving. And so those of you that know me will know that I've done my PADI open water, my PADI advanced, and my PADI enriched air. I'm now able to dive down to 40 meters. The lowest I've been is 32 meters, but I've done a lot of dives in my life. And I had the pleasure of diving with my best friend, who is also a dive master and instructor. And I've dived here in UAE, I've dived in Oman, I've dived in Ras Al Khaimah and Fujairah and various areas in Musandam on live on board dhows. And with everything in life, there is an element of risk, and risk and reward. We have to understand what we're putting ourselves into. So one of the things with mountaineering is that you have to have the right equipment. You also have to be prepared, because at any point, the higher you go, the weather can change. And my wife, she was brave enough and strong enough and fit enough to climb Kilimanjaro. Some of my friends, one of which is on the webinar today, he also climbed Kilimanjaro, and some of the people that went with him actually had to be evac'd off the mountain because they were suffering from altitude sickness. And that's one of the aspects that can happen. And so when we think about risk and risk management, there's always a mitigation of risk, but at the same time, risk and reward, there's two elements. So for me, overcoming my fear of drowning and going through my whole scuba diving experience allowed me to embrace and understand nature. And one of the things that happens when I go scuba diving is I completely forget everything that's happening in my life. And one of the things that really touches me when I do scuba diving is the enormity of nature and the beauty of nature. I've been very lucky to see lots of beautiful creatures under the sea. I've also seen a shark. Luckily, I wasn't attacked by that shark. I've seen stingray, I've seen turtles, seahorses, and tigerfish and scorpion fish and various other schools of fish, and it's been quite amazing. And then to see the coral reefs as well. And so from this respect, sometimes we have to take an element of fear in order to get a reward. And so risk management really is understanding the risk that we're putting ourselves into. And when we think of it from the corporate respect, risk management is about understanding the opportunities and the threats. Those things, there's upside risk and there's also downside risk. And so we have to consider all of those elements. And today we'll be talking about the cultural aspects of how to embed and get an optimized enterprise risk management process in place and a framework that aligns and works across all levels of the organization. And so when we think about a business is really there as a corporate vehicle to increase shareholder value. And so the shareholders appoint the directors. They also appoint the external auditors, and those two bodies are there to give independent advice and to grow the business. The directors provide strategic direction, and then they work closely with the CEO or the group CEO to implement the strategic direction and the plan. And so all of this is tied to purpose. A company is formed for a reason. Why was your company formed? What is the purpose of your entity? Is it to be the largest bank in the world? Is it to be the most accessible bank in your region? Maybe you're there to provide the best customer service and the fastest delivery of items. If we think about companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, their purpose is to add value in different ways. And your organization, my organization, every organization has a purpose. And the purpose is not just the commercial purpose. The purpose is there to fulfill a need within the marketplace that we're operating in. And if you look on our website, governance-gurus.ae, you'll see that we've got our mission and our vision of what we're trying to achieve and what we're aiming towards. And things don't happen overnight. We have to consider the aspects of risk. Yes, we're in the middle of COVID-19, but there are opportunities. There are also threats. Some businesses will continue and others will fail. And this is the time for us to look strategically at how we embrace risk and how we identify risk and then how we treat risk. And so we'll look at those elements as we go along today. But fundamentally, as the slide shows, we have a strategic plan. That plan is put together by the senior leadership team and the executive team and presented to the board for approval. The board will provide some form of strategic direction. Maybe there's a mandate that's given to the group CEO or the CEO, and the CEO should be empowered to implement the strategy, the business plan, and have the budget and resources to enable them to adequately manage risk and to achieve the business objectives of the company. And so ultimately, everything should be tied back to the vision statement. Also, the mission should be guiding towards where the company is looking to head. And so the strategic plan is there as a vehicle to provide some form of articulation of what is desired and how that's achieved. And then based on that, the CEO and the chiefs and also the organization will be judged based on their performance against the strategic plan, the annual budget, and also the business plan that may be for 12 months, 18 months, or a longer period. But all of this has to be done within the core values and beliefs of the organization. And when we think about culture, culture is about reward and also about punishment. And in order to embed good corporate culture, leadership need to be modeling the way. Tone from the top. And so when we think about the board and management, one of the things that they have to consider is how all of these aspects tie together. And I've put here governance and risk framework because ultimately governance is your umbrella that goes across the organization. And one of those elements is, of course, risk management. The other element is, of course, compliance. So governance, risk, and compliance are intrinsically linked. And so when we think about the board of directors and how they perform, what is their goal? The board of directors is there to promote the success of the company and to look for sustainable growth and add shareholder value. Now, this is for commercial entities. We've also got not-for-profit organizations and government corporations and other organizations such as charities. And so the purpose may be slightly different depending on whether it's a state-owned enterprise, a listed company, or a small, medium size enterprise trying to do business in the marketplace. But some of the key functions are that all businesses, whether large or small, public, private, or government, or state-owned, all of these organizations need to take a look back and look at the risk element. What is the risk universe? When we talk about risk universe, that's the maximum risk that that entity is exposed to. Then we talk about risk tolerance and risk appetite. And so if we think about two areas, if we think about risk universe, it may be this size, risk tolerance may be this size, and risk appetite may be smaller, upwards or downwards. The board or the company has an appetite that's less than its tolerance. What that means is that a company has the capacity to make massive losses up to a certain point. That may be its full tolerance that it's able to achieve, but the actual appetite may be upwards or downwards of 5% and 10%, 15%. It all depends. And so in this particular time, boards and management teams, leadership management teams, have been very busy looking at, number one, the risks of the company, but also looking about compliance and then considering some of the knock-on effects. Is their model fit for purpose? Is it still relevant today? Have they got the policies and procedures and internal controls in place? Many businesses have moved to a hybrid model where people are working from home and they're working remotely, and also a number of people are still going into the office. Many businesses didn't have the framework in place and the policies and procedures to manage the aspects of home workers. And so many businesses have had to adapt and develop new policies and procedures as they go along the way. And when we think about risk, risk is multifaceted. We're not just talking about inherent risk, we're talking about residual risk, and also we're looking at emerging risks. And the emerging risk is almost like looking into a crystal ball. What could happen? What is likely to happen in the future. And so Coso defines risk as the possibility that events will occur and affect the achievement of strategy and business objectives. And so from this respect, it's all around the elements of successfully achieving strategy and also making sure that the business achieves its objectives, making sure that shareholder value and the budget and other aspects have been achieved. We talk about risk management and many people don't really understand how risk applies to them. And later we'll be talking about the 3 lines of defense. And this is a model that has been around for around 20 plus years. And just recently we saw that there's been a slight update in regards to the 3 lines of defense. For myself, I have developed what I see is a different form of defense that goes beyond the 3 lines of defense. But we'll talk about that later on today. So when we think about the risk life cycle, we look at the various aspects, and we'll have seen in the very first webinar that we had, or the second webinar, we had this same slide, and it's very important for us to circle back and look at risk management and how it ties in to the success of the company, because ultimately that is what the board's there, that's what senior management are there for, to increase the longevity and the success of the organization. Many businesses have already gone out of business based on them not having enough cash flow, not being able to identify risks quickly enough, and then not being able to implement an action plan to mitigate or treat the risk. And we'll talk about some of those elements later. Also, when we think about monitoring performance, companies historically have monitored performance maybe on a quarterly basis or a half-yearly basis. The world has changed. We're in the 4th industrial revolution. Things have changed. Everything happens at a much quicker pace. Technology has disrupted many businesses. We look at the banking industry, technology has disrupted the banking industry. If we look at telecommunications and some of the aspects of technology, it has impacted telecommunication companies. If we think about cryptocurrency and other aspects, this has unsettled both the banking sector and also the telecommunication sector, because where does certain aspects come in? When we've got mobile payment gateways and other aspects, is it governed by the central bank? Is it governed by the telecommunications and communication regulatory authority in the various country, or is it a combination of both? And sometimes with innovation and change, the people that are the trendsetters, the regulators, are a little behind in regards to some of the risks that are present based on those new innovations and technologies. And so one of the things that we've seen here in the United Arab Emirates is that in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, they've embraced the aspects of fintech and regtech, and in Dubai they've created a hub there in the Dubai International Financial Center. And then if we look at Abu Dhabi have done something similar just recently. They've put together an incubator to allow businesses to start developing technology and use technology. And so we're seeing developments that are happening across the UAE. But if we take a step back and look holistically, globally, we're seeing many changes happening, and things that would normally take 5 or 10 years, those are now taking a lot they're a lot quicker to come to market. New entrants into the market are disrupting the old ways of doing things, and so we have to adapt and develop and look at our risk management as a tool to enable us to get the view of the truth. There should be systems in place that allow for independent information that can be accessed by the leadership management team and also the board at any given point of time. And so we can't talk about enterprise risk management without at least talking about some of the fundamental areas. If we think about risk profile, what is a risk profile? The broad parameters an organization considers in executing its business strategy in its chosen industry and environment. Risk appetite, and again, the definition of risk appetite will change between Coso 2017 and the recent ERM that was released in 2020 and ISO 31000. But there's various definitions of risk appetite. But effectively, it's the level of uncertainty an organization is willing to assume given the corresponding reward associated with the risk. And there should be an understanding of what that uncertainty and the levels of uncertainty are. And then, of course, we have to think about risk tolerance. A stated amount of risk an organization is willing and or able to keep in executing its business strategy. In other words, the limits of a company's capacity for taking on risk. But when we think about risk appetite, risk tolerance, we also have to think about risk capacity. How much capacity does the organization have? How embedded is their risk management function? Do we just have an isolated department of maybe 5 people who are then rolling out policies and procedures, or do we have a fully blown department that's integrated across governance, risk and compliance at the group level, and then working with divisional heads or entity boards to ensure that risk is cascaded all the way down to the front line, so that the receptionist and the security guard, so that the person procuring items, the salesperson, the manufacturing person on the factory floor understands risk. And that's where culture comes into play. Culture is bringing people together with you, getting them to buy in to the purpose and the understanding of why we have risk management and the benefits of risk management. Risk management should be an enabler in the same way that governance should be an enabler. It shouldn't block the business from being commercial, but at the same time, governance, risk and compliance are there as safeguards to ensure that the business is being handled and carried out based on, one, the purpose of the organization, two, the vision and core values, and according to the mission and vision. And so from this respect, there has to be ethical behavior. Individuals need to operate within their authorities. They need to understand their responsibilities, and there needs to be accountability. Very often where you have different people who believe that compliance or risk is not part of their job, especially on the front line or the first line of defense, those individuals will pass the compliance and risk aspects to the second line. And what's really meant to happen within an organization is that the first line of defense are meant to understand what is risk, what is the risk appetite, what is the risk tolerance based on their position, and also the products and services that are being provided to customers. And there is meant to be a certain level of interaction there, because many of the first line are having face-to-face interactions with customers. You also have back office support staff and support functions such as IT and HR and other aspects that could be either first line or second line. But quite often the first line and second line are very much blurred. And so because of this, there is a complete overlap in regards to responsibility and accountability, and each one thinks it's the other's job to do that. And so as an organization, we have come across where there wasn't really a second line, and the first line was meant to be 1.5, and then you had the third line that was covering the second line, and the third line is meant to be an independent review of both the second line and the first line, and we'll talk about that as we go along today. And so the traditional 3 lines of defense talks about operations or service delivery, first line of defense, compliance and risk as the second line of defense, and then the third line of defense is the internal audit function, whether that's an in-house function or whether that's an in-sourced function. Many businesses will bring an external internal auditor into the organization if they don't have the capacity or the skill to do the relevant independent checking in regards to the policies and procedures that are taking place and the way that the company is discharging its compliance risks and looking at risk management as a whole. So these are the 3 lines of defense, and if you search in Google 3 lines of defense, you'll see various publications that bring up and talk about the basic 3 lines of defense. And as an organization, we have to think about what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve the corporate objectives or the organizational objectives of the business. And so company purpose is in the heart of that. Why was the company formed? What is the purpose of the company? Why are we doing business? And what is the main driver for us having this company or organization or group, whether it be local or international? We have to consider these aspects of company purpose. We then have to tie that into our vision. What is vision? It's looking to the future. Where do we want to be? What do we want to be? Then we have to also consider mission. How will we achieve the vision that has been set? And then this has to be underpinned by core values and ethics, integrity. We have to do business in an ethical manner. We've seen companies who have been unethical. We've seen numerous organizations that have achieved the mission based on the strategic plan and the business objectives, but they haven't been done within the core values and ethics of the company. And so we saw Siemens back in 2006 to 2008, and then further into 2013, there were various allegations of bribery and fraud. We saw recently about Airbus. We did a case study in one of our webinars as we went along, looking at the story of Wells Fargo and how they, even before the financial crisis in 2008, were mis-selling insurance, mis-selling mortgages, and then we got into the aspect of the massive fraud, as it was stated by the committee, talking about the false and fake accounts. At one point, it was thought that 2 million fake accounts were fraudulently created, whether it be checking accounts or credit card accounts or saving accounts that were inappropriate for the customers. And the chairman and CEO was on record as saying 8 is great. In other words, that his aim was that each customer would have 8 accounts, whether it be credit cards, saving, checking, or other accounts. And so the story for Wells Fargo goes on. And if you look back at our other webinars in the series, I do a timeline of Wells Fargo from the early 2000s all the way to 2020. And we also do a correlation looking at the share price as well, how that was impacted during the time where the market felt that the organization was achieving its goals and doing it according to core ethics and the core values. And then later on, what happened to the organization when certain things were discovered. And so there has to be a strategic plan, and that's our vehicle to lead us to where we want to be. And we do that through our business plan, which may be 12 or 18 months, and it could be a revolving business plan. And then, of course, there should be some form of measure, a group balance scorecard or some other method to measure the actual performance based on financial and non-financial KPIs, and also looking in the context of the corporate culture. Were these targets achieved? Were they done based on the core values and ethics? And there are various organizations that will penalize people based on their score. They maybe get a high score on their annual appraisal, but because they didn't do things in an ethical manner or according to the spirit of what was required in regards to collaboration and other aspects, then they're downgraded when it comes to their overall bonus and remuneration package. And so I have designed what I say is beyond the 3 lines of defense. None of the models talk about the role of the company secretary. And if we think about the United Arab Emirates and we think about listed companies here, one of the things that's just recently changed in the corporate governance code is that the company secretary now has to independently report into the board, that the board appoint and remove the company secretary. This model has been in place in numerous countries across the world. And you think about the company secretary, they have a very interesting role. And so when we think about the governance, risk and compliance function and how this ties in to realistically, not just on paper, but realistically into an organization and into the culture of an organization, we have to consider various things. So ultimately, senior management are tasked with managing risk within the organization. They are the divisional heads, the chiefs of the various sections. And so they are managing and they are monitoring first line of defense. They're also looking at the second line of defense, the compliance and risk function. They're also, to a degree, getting input from internal audit. Now, internal audit, again, should and must be an independent function that cannot be just removed by the CEO or the general manager of a business. Now, ultimately, if we think about the triangle of an organization, the person at the top, the chief executive officer, I also call them the chief risk taker, because ultimately the CEO is trying to find opportunities in the market and to capitalize on the risk opportunities based on the methodology of risk management. And so these management functions feed in to the CEO. And the role of the CEO is to report in sometimes into the audit committees. Definitely when it comes to the financials and certain aspects, there has to be a reporting into the audit function, and then ultimately into the board of directors, or if it's a different organization model, into the ultimate reporting governing body. And so the CEO will report either into the audit committee on an ad hoc basis, but ultimately they'll be reporting into the board. And internal audit should have a direct line into the audit committee, providing feedback, giving guidance in regards to aspects of fraud, high risk elements, and elements that could have a major impact. And when we think about the three lines of defense, they shouldn't work independently against each other, and they shouldn't happen in sequence, first, second, third, but they should be working in unison together. And there needs to be an understanding from internal audit of what the business is trying to achieve, and working with management to ensure that the framework is there and it's independently checked and scenarios and samplings are taking place. And so we think about the company secretary. They should be the independent and holistic view of the truth. Why do I say that? Why do I say it's the company secretary and not internal audit? Well, the company secretary or board secretary or corporate secretary or chartered company secretary, that person is an individual that has been appointed by the board of directors to support the board of directors and provide governance, advice, and company secretarial excellence. And that individual and their team should have a good understanding of the laws and regulations that are in place, and also what are the roles and responsibilities and fiduciary duties of not just the board and the committees, but also the management team. And so from this respect, they are reporting into the various committees. And I've just put the audit committee, but you could have nomination and remuneration committee could be there, the investment committee, the credit committee, the risk committee, there could be a governance committee, there could be all kinds of committees. And so the governance risk framework goes across the whole organization, from first line all the way up to the board of directors. And there should be clear responsibility and accountability assigned, and definitions and job descriptions for everyone. We don't want the CEO and the chairman or chairperson having conflicting aspects. There shouldn't be an overlap. There should be a strategic aspect for the running of the board and an oversight of management, and the empowerment by the CEO or group CEO. How does that happen? That happens by the board providing the CEO with a delegation of authority and a matrix that allows the CEO to be able to make decisions based on certain thresholds and on the underlying risk and governance framework that's there to provide a function for people to be able to make effective decisions based on the information to hand. And that information should be objective and not subjective. It should be in a dashboard that cannot easily be manipulated, whether it's financial reporting or the aspects of non-financial reporting. But it doesn't end there. The CEO needs to provide, and their team need to provide, assurance into the audit committee that, number one, internal processes and internal controls and the risk management is fit for purpose, that the financials and the non-financial information that's been provided to the audit committee to review and approve for presentation to the board of directors is correct, accurate, and provided in a timely manner. And the audit committee, which was formed as a sub-body of the board, it then also provides assurance to the board of directors, who ultimately will approve the financial statements, the governance report, the strategic report, and various other reports that are required internationally as companies do business. And so we think about the external parties. The external auditor was appointed by the shareholders. The directors were appointed by the shareholders. And so independently, the external auditor should be sampling and looking at high, medium, and low risk. If there's high risk, then it may be that they have to give a qualified audit report, and they may sit with the CEO and provide certain guidance, and the CEO and their team should be providing some level of comfort to the external auditors. The company secretary definitely has a relationship with the external auditor, and the internal audit plan and the external auditor plan do actually tie together, because quite often your internal audit function will cover certain aspects, whilst the external audit will cover other aspects. They shouldn't be looking at the same thing at the same time, because on a yearly basis, certain aspects need to be looked across the business, and those need to be set based on the risk appetite and tolerance. And risk appetite and tolerance don't stay the same across all areas of the business, and they can be reduced or increased based on the guidance and the ability and the financial performance of the organization. But ultimately, shareholders want to see value, and risk management is about adding shareholder value. But we also have to consider the wider stakeholders, employees, and in this time, we think of COVID-19 and other aspects that are taking place. We're thinking about the way companies have made people redundant. In various countries, they've been furloughed. In other countries, they've been forced to take annual leave, paid annual leave. And in other aspects, we're seeing people have to take pay cuts. Some companies are doing huge pay cuts, and who knows how long that will continue on for. But there have been globally mass redundancies that have taken place. And then we think about the regulators and the supervisors, but we also have to consider two other particular influencing aspects: the corporate social responsibility and also the environmental and climate change aspects. And so when we think about stakeholders and regulators, there's now further scrutiny on businesses. How not only are they doing things ethically, but how is it tied in to the environment and climate, but also to corporate social responsibility. And if we think about the King 4 report, King 4 report 2016 has talked about integrated reporting, and one of the things that companies in South Africa have to do is that they have to, number one, be giving back to society and employing people locally and developing infrastructure, but they also need to be looking at the impact that they have when it comes to the environment. And then on a third aspect, they also have to be paying taxes and not avoiding taxes. And so Coso touches, and I like Coso, this is the 2017 model, but there has been an updated enterprise risk management model that was brought in 2020. But I go back to this function because it talks about the 5 pillars: mission, vision, and core values, strategy development, business objective formulation, implementation and performance, and enhanced value. Ultimately, that's your timeline. And what I like about Coso is that it starts off with governance and culture. Governance and culture, once embedded, then the rest of the things can be achieved. Peter Drucker mentioned that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if we get our culture and our governance and our framework right, achieving strategic objectives and performing well is part of the DNA of the organization, because it's inbuilt. If we get a risk culture embedded within the business, if people understand risk, then they will see that everyone is meant to be identifying and raising issues when they see emerging risks or where they see gaps within the system or policies and procedures. But again, these should be captured in the fourth pillar, the review and revision. Not everything stays the same. Enterprise risk management, governance excellence is a journey. It's something that should develop and be enhanced as time goes ahead. And of course, the only way that we can enhance value is by using the information that's provided to us and communicating that, and then feeding back down the line to ensure that we build capabilities and fill gaps within the business as we go along. And so ISO 31000 talks about risk management, and it talks about the 7 R's and the 4 T's: recognition or identification of risk, ranking or evaluation of risk, responding to significant risks, resourcing controls, reaction plan, reporting and monitoring risk performance, review and risk management framework. And then we think about the 4 T's: tolerate, treat, transfer, or terminate. And so their model, this model is basically put together in this particular framework. And as you can see, it's a loop, and everything is interaction between the various functions. Risk management should not be something that's done in isolation. It should be done at the first line, the second line, at the third line. It is also, there should be some controls at the audit function, and if you've got a risk management committee too. But ultimately, the board needs to be sure and feel comfort and have assurance from management and the audit committee and the risk committee that the relevant internal controls and mechanisms are there heading towards excellence. So how do we go about implementing and building this culture? Well, number one, it is through education, making sure that number one, that frameworks and policies and procedures are drafted in a way that people can understand and people can identify with, and they understand how they fit within the overall enterprise risk management structure, that they are an integral part, whether they're first line, second line, or third line, whether they're in the leadership role of management or on the board or as a shareholder. And so stakeholder and shareholders have an aspect when they think about risk management and feeding back into the organization. And culture doesn't happen by accident. If we don't control culture, it will control us. And the behaviors, if we don't have tone from the top, if we don't use the consistent language and terminology, people will not be aligned with what the board want to achieve and what the leadership team are trying to achieve. Because if they say one thing and reward different behavior than is within the core values and ethics and integrity of the organization, then the words that are said and the reward is different. Whereas if people are penalized based on not performing to the standard that was required to them, but missing the mark when it comes to ethics and integrity, then there should be an element of weightage that is removed when it comes to remuneration and to bonus. And when people are impacted based on their ability to be able to earn, it makes them think twice. But ultimately, we want people to be doing things from the heart, but we have to start somewhere. So there has to be a carrot and there has to be a stick. and we have to adapt and adopt things in the correct. So that brings the session today to a close, and I want to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions. Do we have any questions that have come through from anyone today? Does that all make sense? So if you want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. And so when we think about risk management, one of the things sometimes board of directors don't fully grasp or provide or allow enough time for risk managers to be able to consider the heat map, the impact, and also the likelihood of risk. And many boards will put maybe the top 10 or top 20 group risks and consider those on a quarterly basis. But there are times where there needs to be a more robust and more focused approach, not just looking at the top 20 risks, but also looking at elements of the risks that are emerging. And yes, of course, risk has to be handled, has to be understood, and we have to be able to implement a framework that will allow people to implement what is required. I've got a question here. Why do companies fail in predicting real risks? Why the majority of auditors, including the Big Four, fail in most cases to predict risks in a timely manner? Very good question, thank you for that. And so there's two elements there. Number one, if we look at historic risk management and how that takes place, in many organizations, risk management is seen as a separate function rather than an enterprise or group-wide responsibility across all areas of the organization, vertically and horizontally as well. And so that's an educational aspect. When we think about auditors and auditors predicting risks, well, what is an auditor doing? An auditor, if we think about an external auditor, they're looking at the information that's provided to them in that particular period. They're looking at the financials that were provided based on a certain time. So they'll be looking at the balance sheet, cash balances, and other aspects. They'll be doing some retrospective looking back, and they'll be doing some review in regards to the current ways that management are managing risk, and they'll be providing some form of feedback. The problem is that the board appoint the auditors based on the shareholders. So the board recommend, the shareholders approve, and then who is the person that pays for the audit services? It will be the CEO or the CFO who's providing the financial statements and all of the methodology to the auditors. That will be the executive team. And so one of the elements of external audit is that the auditors will be provided with a letter of management representation. And so management, the executive, chief executive, and potentially the CFO will sign a letter to the auditor saying that the information that they've provided is factual and correct, and that there are no instances of fraud and other elements. And so the auditor, in a way, has got to get out of jail free, because they've done their sampling, they've done their review based on the information provided to them, and then they have the comfort that the management team are signing off and endorsing that the information was correct and factual. Now, as we've seen in the aspects of Carillion and the alleged fraud that has taken place at NMC in regards to hiding large debt, and other businesses, Wirecard and multiple businesses, then we have to say, are auditors doing enough? And quite often the fees are squeezed. And right now in the UK, there is a review about splitting up the audit function and these audit firms that also have the consulting and legal elements. So there's a process underway right now to split the audit and non-audit elements into two separate areas, so that auditors have to perform to a higher standard. So the Financial Reporting Council is now looking at these aspects. Good question. So how often do I think risks should be reviewed by the board? In that respect, right now, I think that at every board meeting, risk should be considered. There should at least be a 15 or 30-minute slot looking at current risks, residual risks, and also, of course, looking at emerging risks and looking at the various elements and the impact that certain actions could take. Another quick question that came in: how do you ensure that black swan events such as pandemic risks are treated seriously before they happen? Well, if we had a crystal ball or we could see into the future, we would never be caught unawares. Many businesses were caught unawares, even businesses that had put in place crisis management aspects that even considered pandemic or epidemic or serious aspects in regards to elements of disease or interruption from business based on certain criteria. Unfortunately, many businesses, because it's high impact, low probability, many businesses have not seen these black swan events as being important. Now, one of the aspects that can be put there, if we think about the 4 T's, is tolerate, trim, terminate, or transfer. Now, in this respect, many companies could put in place a contingent policy based on pandemics and the disruption to business. That would be one preventative manner. You're actually transferring the risk to an insurance company. Yes, you're paying a premium for that. Right now, that many companies won't, insurance companies wouldn't be offering such a package. But if boards had have been forward thinking, yes, it's low risk, but high impact. As this emerged, businesses could have put in place insurance mechanisms that transferred the risk from the business to insurers, or at least shared part of the risk with insurers. Hopefully that answers that particular question. Do we have any last questions before we draw the session to a close? I thank you one and all. For those of you that don't know me, there's some aspects regarding me as a professional and an individual, and you'll see on the bottom right hand side is a QR code, and if you want to sign up for our newsletter and to get invites to other complimentary webinars, please scan the QR code and you'll be getting our newsletter and updates about future events. I thank you all for your participation. It's been a pleasure facilitating the last 6 webinars. I've really enjoyed the various subjects. For me, governance, culture, the role of the company secretary, emotional intelligence and strategy and agile leadership are all intrinsically linked together. There isn't a one size that fits all, but also we have to remember that we are aiming towards perfection. Perfection doesn't happen overnight. Even when we think that we've reached the pinnacle, once we get to the top, we will see that there are other aspects and other things that we could have done better. So whether it's governance or risk management or enterprise risk management, there are always things that we can do better, lessons that can be learned along the way. And so I wish you all a great day ahead. Stay safe, look after yourself and look after your loved ones. And I hope to see you again soon.